Welcome to Good Journeys with Second Mountain, the podcast that shines a spotlight on inspiring people and their inspired stories. Coming up on this episode.
From a really young age, I was politicized from primary school age, being stopped by the police, witnessing certain things happening around me in my environment, including, being attacked myself by a racist on the high road. You quickly lose your innocence and you quickly become politicized at different points, angry at other points, meek, you're sort of going up and down. But the thing that you really become is quite distrustful of institutions or those that are meant to be there to protect you. And also you spend a lot of your time being slightly paranoid because you're trying to navigate your way around a world where, you haven't done anything bad, but you are being treated as if you are a criminal or doing things bad.
Hello and welcome to Good Journeys with Second Mountain, the purpose-driven podcast. I'm your host, Ben Veal, founder of Second Mountain Comms. I set up my business to help good people do good, and in today's episode, I'm speaking with an author who is passionate about doing good better. Derek A. Bardowell is a philanthropy advisor, transformative coach, and author of the new book, Giving Back, How to Do Good Better. Once a music journalist and youth worker, Derek's first book, No Win Race, explored race and racism in modern Britain through the prism of sport, and was both a Sunday Times and Financial Times Book of the Year. In Giving Back, he reimagines philanthropy and explores how big social problems, from climate change to racial injustice, can be tackled in modern society by all of us. Derek is the CEO of 10 Years Time, an organisation that exists to help donors and foundations to interrogate their wealth, unlearn harmful practices, and develop holistic and equitable approaches to philanthropy. It's a real pleasure to have Derek join me on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
How are you, Derek? You well?
Yeah, I'm good. Really good to see you again. And really looking forward to this.
We had the opportunity to meet, didn't we, in Bath a couple of months ago when you were doing the Bath Literature Festival. How was that for you?
The festival was fantastic. I did it with John Alexander, who's the author of Citizens, and I feel like we either distant relatives or something, but because we definitely aligned as soon as we met, and there was so much of the stuff that he's written in his book that really resonates about, the power of people to, really affect change in this society and in this world.
I find it incredible because I read both books side by side, and I found it incredible that you two hadn't met. You kind of published these two books coming at it from very different angles and from very different backgrounds, but there's so much crossover between Giving Back and Citizens, isn't there?
Yeah, it's and it was, so one is just the spirit and soul. So when I read Citizens, that there was just the spirit and soul in what John was saying just very much resonated to me. And part of that is having huge levels of faith in people and ordinary people. When I say ordinary people, I'm not saying no one's ordinary, but I mean those that are not in positions of power. So it's having that faith in people more so than the institutions that are there to govern us, and often the people that are in power of those institutions to govern us. And I think that's what really resonated with the stories that both of us told in our books was illustrations of people. Some of them will be around the corner for people that are listening to this podcast, right? Who are doing remarkable things that's contributing to a better world.
I think, the timing of both of those books is just so highly topical, and we'll come on as this conversation goes on today. We'll talk about lockdown and your experiences and some of the things, let's just say, that weren't done particularly well by certain people in power during that time. But before we get onto that, I wanted to kind of just have a bit of background first, if you can set the scene. So before we get on to Giving Back and the work you're doing now through 10 Years Time, kind of what led you to the point where you are today, Derek, and what's been your journey so far?
So I grew up in the East End in Newham in the 1980s, which for anyone that was around at that particular time was an incredibly hostile environment for anyone Black or brown in that area. The National Front, which was the racist party of the time, conducted huge amounts of attacks, killings, and all types of things against racially minoritized communities there. And there was very little protection from the police. So I guess from a really, really young age, I was politicized from primary school age, being stopped by the police, witnessing certain things happening around me in my environment, including, being attacked myself by a racist on the high road. You quickly lose your innocence and you quickly become politicized at different points, angry at other points, meek. You're sort of going up and down, but the thing that you really become is quite distrustful of institutions or those that are meant to be there to protect you. And also you spend a lot of your time being slightly paranoid because you're trying to navigate your way around a world where you haven't done anything bad, but you are being treated as if you are a criminal or doing things bad.
What age do you think you were when you first kind of were aware that you weren't being treated in the same way as other people?
So the first realization, physically, not me personally, the first realization was the Alan Minter Marvin Hagler fight in 1980. And when they fought and Marvin Hagler won the fight at Wembley Arena and in the third round, and then basically, he was just attacked and people were throwing things in the ring, during his moment of glory, he was just attacked, and it was built as a heavily racist affair that had been built up in that particular way. And I remember at that time it being the first realization, because leading up to the fight, I wanted Alan Minter to win because he was English, and even though he was white, I just didn't really see things that way. I saw him as English and Marvin Hagler as American, and I want the English guy to win. And so that kind of changed my perspective on it. It didn't change it straight away. It just shook me, and it just was the first kind of realization. And then I think probably about a year later, you had the New Cross fire, you then had the Brixton riots, you had all of these uprisings that I was seeing in the newspapers and the press. And of course, it's not like your school would tell you about what's going on in the world. So you're experiencing these things as a kid, and it's affecting you. I remember I used to be scared walking out. I didn't know how close Brixton was to Manor Park where I grew up. So for me, when I was walking to school, and it sounds funny thinking back, but I was scared to go out because I was like, oh my God, how close are these riots to me? I just didn't sort of understand the proximity, but the proximity felt very close. And then I think probably 8, 9 years of age. So yeah, again, it would have been 81, 82. I remember going into a sweet shop with my best friend who was white, and we went into the shop. And as I came out of the shop, the police stopped me and frisked me, but didn't do anything to my white friend. And that was the first kind of incident where I was like, oh, okay, things are different. I am a target, and there is this spotlight on me, and this spotlight is very negative. And as much as you try to, and I think when I was a kid, I kind of ran away from it. So I spent a lot of time just saying, no, this doesn't really exist. I was just in denial a lot of the time. There was just constant reinforcements in everything from going into a sweet shop and, the person behind the counter saying they're going to call the police on me, to the expectations that teachers had of my skills and ability, to, as I said, various incidents that would be happening around me, people clutching their bags when I was in their presence and stuff like that. There was just this reinforcement that occurred all of the time and in everyday situations. I'm not talking about these being monumental, me being chased by a bunch of racists at 12 o'clock at night. I'm just talking about the daily incidences at bus stops.
Yeah. You're talking about essentially small little acts of grinding you down, aren't you? And
grinding you down just daily.
I guess your identity every day, kind of questioning your identity in terms of where do you fit into British society.
Yeah, and as I said, while my mum and dad did cooked Jamaican food because they're from Jamaica and all of that sort of stuff. And, we had reggae music blasting in the background and stuff. But the thing is that as much as I like the music and stuff like that, I was eating fish and chips and I don't know, watching Coronation Street. And do you know what I mean? It's I have a dual identity that is Caribbean heritage as well as being English born. So you have the dual heritage. It's where those incidents created conflict within those two things. They couldn't coexist naturally. And like for me, it felt like they could coexist naturally, that, on a Sunday I could eat rice and peas and all of that. And then the following day I could have a chip butty. It's all good.
Sure.
I could listen to Bob Marley one day and I could listen to Adam and the Ants the next day. For me, it was like, as a young kid, it was all quite natural. But as I said, within that very brief period, probably a 2-year period, that conflict became very much defined, and it felt like you had to be one or the other.
How did that conflict kind of progress in terms of where you are now and your kind of journey towards 10 years' time?
So I think for me, that story and that time is really important, because I might not have realized it at the time, through the years, but whatever that is, it wouldn't have really mattered what profession I'd gone into. That politics and that viewpoint and that real desire to address race and racism in this society would be in anything that I do. It's just present there. So whether I'm in philanthropy or the third sector or journalism, it would all be the type of stuff that I would do. And I guess what occurred for me, I wasn't great at school, but eventually I pulled my way up, worked really hard, and got my degree, and felt at that particular point I'd done everything that society had said that I should do. That was kind of like the route, right? Get a degree. And, I think I was the first one in my family to get a degree and all of that. So it was amazing. But then I spent pretty much most of my 20s without any secured employment. And part of that was, I would go in for interviews. I had multiple interviews. People would say, we're not hiring anymore once they'd seen me. Or sometimes with my CV, when I would send it in as Derek Bardowell, I wouldn't get anyone calling me back. But then when I'd use my second name, Derek Anthony, they'd call me in for interview. So this went on for several years. And actually, that's how I entered journalism initially, was because I felt like the one thing that I could offer was writing views. I loved music, and that was my route. So I just wrote for loads of people free of charge and built up a career that way, because it wasn't dependent on me doing a job interview. It was just dependent on me having a portfolio, me being able to hit deadlines. There was this sort of agency called Power Moves who sort of hired me to write for them and do reggae. I was a reggae journalist primarily and a music journalist. That gave me an inroad into my career. And as I said, it wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I got a job through a formal interview. So much of my 20s was freelancing. But while I was freelancing, I had lots of young people that would contact me who were interested in journalism, and they would do work placements at various places that I was working at, or come to interviews with me and all of that sort of stuff. And I started to get very interested in youth work and stuff like that. So while I was still a journalist and a freelance journalist, I retrained as a youth worker, got some qualifications, and started splitting my career between the journalism and youth work. Often I would be teaching young people around journalism and stuff. So that's how I sort of started moving from journalism to the third sector. I moved to Children's Express, which was a fabulous job, which was a program of learning through journalism. So it was like the ideal thing for me, bringing, two loves of working with young people as well as journalism. Eventually moved to the Stephen Lawrence Trust and was their Director of Education and Learning for a few years, supporting that work. But the philanthropic side really came out of running these programs over a number of years in the noughties, that, we do independent evaluations, have them audited, they'd be successful in terms of what we were meant to deliver in relation to the money that was given to us, but it was always difficult to get refunding, and so for me, I moved into philanthropy to really start to understand how money flowed. What was the magic trick that enabled money to flow into certain projects and not necessarily into my projects? And that was the initial drive to get into it. The second drive was when I would meet grants managers who would be the people managing the programs, financially the programs that I was running. Most of them didn't really have much of an understanding of any of the work that I was doing, the young people I was working with, the stresses and strains of trying to deliver this. And I felt, having done that, if I was on the other side of the fence, I would be able to understand more how people are delivering projects, because I've been there myself, and be more supportive of how to do that. So that was what got me into philanthropy. And, for 10 plus years, I was running different portfolios, giving away money, but saw some of the problems within that. Hence why I'm doing a lot of the work that I do right now in terms of trying to change that dynamic.
And how powerful do you think kind of writing these books? Obviously, you've written No Win Race and now Giving Back. What role does that play in terms of helping you to hopefully shake up the system in a positive direction?
Well, first and foremost, it's gone full circle for me, because obviously I started as a journalist, and so coming back to writing is, on a personal level, just some wonderful form of, I don't know, healing and solace and stuff. So from a purely sort of personal perspective, I think when I was a kid, there was two things I wanted to do. One was to be an A&R man. So I wanted to be a music scout. I loved hip hop. Hip hop was my life. So I was like, yo, I want to be a scout and find great artists. And I didn't have any inroads into that as a career. The other thing that I was really keen to do when I was a kid was write books. And I really wanted to write the type of books that I wanted to read as a teenager that wasn't in my school library or accessible to me or on the curriculum. So, I didn't get to fulfill my music. I did music journalism, but I never became a music scout. Coming full circle and being able to write the books that I was passionate about really felt like a beautiful thing, because I think, like, for me, and I don't know if it's the same for you, but so many jobs that you do, there's so many compromises within those jobs. It's very difficult to put 100% of yourself into them, or the 100% of yourself that you're putting into it is often compromised to the point where you can only do 70% because you're negotiating.
It's rare as a writer to be able to ever deliver a piece of content that is 100% yours. You're always making sacrifices. You're always aware of whether it's space constraints or client constraints or for brief or for publication requirements. There's always a sacrifice. And I guess what's refreshing with your own book, once you've got the go ahead and the green light to write the thing, is it's fundamentally yours. It's your words, and it's your opinions, and it's for you to drive it.
Don't get me wrong, I can read the books back and say, oh, I should have done this, and it's not like it's perfect in how it's done. The main thing for me was being able to put 100% into something. So I had a book deal probably from 2010, maybe 2010, or I was about to sign a book deal and was, trying to get published at that point. It didn't happen. And so there was a significant gap between, No Win Race happening. And I think what had happened in that time is, by the time I was trying to sell No Win Race, I kind of didn't care anymore. So I think before, when I was trying to sell my original book, which was called Who Stole the Soul, I was really compromising on some of the content in order to get the book deal. This time round, I was like, you know what, they're going to have to take it as it is. And And that's been the same with both of the books that I've done. I've been fortunate that the publishers I've worked with have enabled me to have creative license to be able to do things in my way. When I say my way, it's, I am writing about philanthropy, but there's lots of stuff about reggae music in there. There's stuff about the Dutch football team of the 70s, they allow me to take the quirks and the side routes to being able to do it. But it also just enables me to say, from a personal level, there's 100% of me in there. So that's, from a personal level, satisfying. But I also do think that when you've written the book, or certainly in writing the book, it opens up different channels of influence in terms of the work that you do. You know, I do lots of podcasts, I do lots of talks, but actually being able to reinforce some of that with my thoughts on how philanthropy can change within the, you know, through the book is sort of also just really, really good as a reference point for people to keep picking up on stuff. I think it also tells the story of the time as well. So it's been, you know, a massive time: George Floyd, COVID, cost of living crisis, austerity, Grenfell, Windrush scandal. The last few years, and you know, pretty much all years are quite brutal for you know, many people in this society. But there's been some quite significant pivotal things that have happened in the last 6-7 years that, in trying to respect and document that, I thought was really, really important.
Yeah, and I think you've done that really well. I mean, so it's very, very cathartic, I found, for me, reading. You kick on very early off with lockdown, and you're very vocal, and you know, I've really resonated with a lot of what you said here. You're very vocal in terms of talking about lockdown experiences for yourself, both for good, for bad, and for downright ugly. And there's a couple of quotes that really jumped out at me. You said that lockdown gave you the time to think, but not enough contact to act. And then you also pull no punches in your criticism of the UK's handling of the pandemic. And you say the government weaponized ambiguity to mask its inability to take decisive action. We were locked up and locked down by a government that did not appear to know what it was doing, further adding to the nation's anxiety. You know, and that really related and resonated to me on multiple levels. I mean, we're now several years on from the worst of it. It feels strange to say we're past it, because it was such a huge, life-changing thing, that pandemic. But what are your personal experiences of that time, Derek? And I guess in the bigger picture, how do you feel that the context of what we're talking about has impacted civil liberties in a larger perspective?
I guess the first thing is to say that, you know, that was written during lockdown, and as we've seen, more and more stuff is being revealed that justifies a lot of the things that I was saying at that particular time. So I think when I say you know, my peer groups, the people that I spoke to, we all had this feeling that this was being poorly done and the leadership was poor. I'm not quite sure that even we knew how bad it was at the time when you were.
I think there was always a hope that
they would.
It was like dithering idiots with somewhat of the best intention, making a real mess of it, not how actively malicious and strategically planned so much of it was.
So you've just nailed it. You know, I probably was a bit more on they are being malicious side, to be fair. But my thought would be, you know, leadership is hard and doing this is really, really hard. But there was just some plain sights that were apparent to me, particularly when we were seeing what was happening in Italy.
I tell you what it was. The penny drop for me. You know Boris's 23rd of March 2020 infamous lockdown speech, where he said we were going into full lockdown. And I remember being at home and just my heart sinking. And obviously we all did think, what would that mean for me? What would that mean for my children? What would that mean for work, family? I watched that clip back about a year later, and you can see the power relish in his eyes. You can see that there's a real enjoyment to that speech. There's a real, I have the whole power of the nation in my hands. It makes for really uncomfortable viewing when you watch it for the benefit of hindsight.
That's interesting. I might watch that again, actually, because I've probably avoided a lot of.
I avoided it for a long time, going back, because it takes me back to a time I don't want to remember. But you rewatch some of those press conferences now, and the way that it was delivered was not delivered in a way that was empathetic and understanding of the sheer toll and impact it's going to have on so many people.
Yeah, and I think there is also just this really horrid, sad reality that one, so much of it was preventable, and two, that many lives could have been saved. Many people could have had the opportunity to send off those that had passed in a far better way. And, I guess for me, the way that we have rushed back to normal and to the status quo, I've found really frightening, because I
have too. I'm glad you said that, because you don't hear that enough, and I have too. I felt really uncomfortable. I feel like we've gone through a period of significant trauma, the likes of which our generation has never known, and it's almost sometimes seems like it never happened, and it really did happen, and it wasn't very long ago.
It wasn't very long ago, and when you think about the climate crisis and issues, more of this will happen. So the things that I think Britain traditionally have been able to say, that's happening in another country, that's not happening in here, that mass scale where everyone is in a very similar position because of a particular disaster, is something that will, in years to come, if we don't get on top of the climate crisis, will be something that's going to be a regular thing for Britain. But going back to this, it was like when Trump became president in the US, and it was like, how the hell can someone like Donald Trump end up being the US president? Something is fundamentally wrong for that to happen. And everyone felt that it was a massive scandal and problematic. But then within 2 or 3 months of his presidency, it suddenly became really normal, and everyone went into these normal reporting cycles. And so that's how COVID has felt, is and again, when I think about our press, and I'm like, good God, our press is a mess, because are they not meant to be the ones that are holding governments and others to account, and the ones that are there to say, no, we can't get into normal reporting cycles or press cycles. Actually, we should be challenging. And when I look around on the television, when I pick up the papers, I'm like, wow, these things really have been brushed under the carpet. These things really are back to normal reporting cycles. And we are less than a couple of years away from the last lockdown and stuff. So, I agree. I
think the press has a very, very, very big role to play in the talking about kind of, you've talked in your book about kind of amplifying the nation's anxiety. I think a lot of the press needs to take a good hard look in the mirror at the role they played in playing up the daily death tolls and amplifying all of the propagandist messages they were receiving from the government and trolling them out carte blanche. Because if the press hadn't played ball and it hadn't been agreeable to do all these prime time press conferences every single day and to report daily death numbers, I mean, I don't know how many people were dying from cancer or strokes or heart attacks or any other natural illness during the time of COVID, but I could probably tell you by day how many people are dying of COVID. And I think that, the press needs to take a good long look at itself and think, why did we allow ourselves to essentially become an amplifier for the Tories?
And look, let's face it as well, post COVID as well, some of the bills and laws that this government have been passing as well, from the immigration bill to the right to protest, and some of the things that are happening, these are bad days, right? These are bad days.
Well, the right to protest bill went through so quietly, didn't it? Terrifyingly quietly.
The power, what the government are doing to take away power, people's human rights, actually people's human rights is absolutely sickening. It's absolutely sickening. But I guess one of the things that also pops into my head is we're not really uprising on a mass scale around a lot of these things. We haven't seen, we saw it after George Floyd. We saw some mass uprisings after George Floyd, but we've also witnessed some, really mass uprisings in France and stuff. And it's like we go into appeasement mode, and that is part of the national identity. And because I think we're a hierarchical country, I think we respect people in power. We almost automatically think that because someone writes in a damn newspaper, and the wasteful journalists in this country that get the privilege of writing in the paper is just scandalously bad. But because they've been elevated to that point, because people who have scandalously been elevated to peerage, getting their peerages and all of that sort of stuff, for some reason we think because they've got a sir or whatever in front of their name, or because they've got a column, that we have to respect them. And we can shout and scream as much as we want on Twitter about how, we don't disagree with this and we disagree with that, but fundamentally we don't necessarily as a nation rebel against it. And on a mass scale and on a continued mass scale, because that's not really part of the character of the country. The part of the character of the country is around empire. Part of the character of the country is around the hierarchy. Part of the character of the country is around those that are the lords and the baronesses, have some form of mythical powers over us as ordinary folks and stuff. And if that wasn't untied during the last 2 or 3 years during COVID, when we recognized the ineptness of people in those particular positions, I don't know what will break it. But I do think that part of that national character around appeasement and around not rebelling, I don't know. I think something's going to break at some point, because the blatantness of what's been happening in recent years in terms of taking away people's human rights from this particular government, and not really having significant opposition either that is hugely attractive in this country, the lack of choice for ordinary people, I think something will very much break very, very soon that will really sort of question the national character and move away somewhat from appeasement. And if it's not this generation, maybe it's going to be the next generation that really, where that starts to happen.
Yeah, I mean, as a cynical communicator, it's not lost on me the fact that we've gone from COVID to the news being covered, dominated by recession and cost of living crisis. As in, this is a new crisis that we can all get behind. That's a bit beyond us, and it's very easy to then go, "Oh, I'm so worried about being able to pay my bills now." And being able to work and provide for my family. I haven't got time to protest. I haven't got time to look at this bigger issue, whether it's climate change or social injustice, because actually, much like COVID did at the outset, and I'll be the first to admit this did it to me. What were my main considerations at the outset? What am I going to do for work? Are my kids going to be okay? Is my wife going to be okay? I think it made everyone literally lock down into their homes to think, how am I going to stay sane? But then out of that, we saw, I remember vividly, because it was COVID, the coverage. And then suddenly George Floyd happened. And then suddenly there was this most incredible moment when you're watching the news, and the news isn't dominated by empty streets, but it's dominated by the absolute opposite of that. And this, what you've described in your book as the largest anti-racism demonstrations that we've witnessed in our collective adult lives, because obviously George Floyd is by far one of the many examples of police brutality over the years, racist police brutality. What do you think it was about his murder specifically that mobilized people on such a big level? And do you think it would have been the same if it hadn't been in the midst of a lockdown?
So, one, you're absolutely right. George Floyd is happening, particularly in the States, all of the time. It's happening over here as well, but often it might be in custody or it will be behind closed doors.
Yeah, it's not filmed for 9 minutes on video camera, is it?
It's the full horror. I've always said that the way that racism plays out in the UK is often more bureaucratic. So this country is very good at not creating martyrs from deaths. It happens, but it happens under closed doors. It happens under the veil of paperwork and things of that nature. In America, partially because of their laws, a lot of this is very blatant. But I think it was the time. I think it was the time. I think it was the time because we had time on a mass scale. We saw the utter blatant, horrid nature of it on film, and we couldn't avoid it in the way that we perhaps could if we were still leading our busy lives in 2019, because it's been happening continually for years and years. So it's not the only death that's been caught on video. It's not the only thing that's been captured in that way. But to see it so stark, to see it as a law enforcement officer that had done it with his colleagues just standing around, not doing anything about it, the blatant nature of it, and also the time and the level of feelings that we were having across the globe through this pandemic, I think was part of the time that caused, such a revelation, because, other things have happened since that hasn't quite resonated. And it's not like things are getting significantly better, but again, they haven't quite resonated since. So, it was May 2020, we were 2 months into lockdown. So when you think about that particular time, everything was incredibly raw for us on a mass scale, and that happening, you're absolutely right. The contrast between the silence in the streets to the protests in the streets was incredibly stark, because it was at that time bringing out feelings that probably many of us had not had for a number of years. And when I say feelings, it's that inability to capture what we were feeling at the time was really scary, because, as I said, we had all of this time on our hands and really very little power over what we could do, the basic things that we could provide for our kids, be it toilet paper, food, and everything was compromised.
I remember the great toilet paper.
Yeah,
Terror. That was the main headline to the start of it, wasn't it?
It was, and again, it was that thing of blaming people, right? Yeah. So, we've had, 40 odd years of sort of do for self. There's no society. Society doesn't exist. And I'm like, people will go out and get what they need to get for themselves, because that is the society that everyone has been grown up on. Is, don't get me wrong, there was huge levels of mutual aid and other beautiful stuff that was going on, which, surprise, surprise, did not make the front page of the newspapers at the time. The way that local food groups like Made Up Kitchen in Hackney, loads of young people delivering food to elderly people, like with local produce and stuff, and there was some amazing stuff that was going on across the whole of the UK that didn't see the light of day in any of the press. But yeah, toilet paper and flour, shortages, we saw lots
of bread.
What's that?
Banana bread.
Banana bread, yeah.
It was a very beautiful time. It sounds so strange to say that, because it was a horrendous time and so many people unnecessarily lost their lives. And as you say, there was so much pain. I've got good, very close friends who, weren't able to be with their parents when they passed away, and other friends who weren't able to be there when the child was born. It was horrendous on so many levels, but there was also a real beauty in it. There was a beauty in silence. There was a beauty in, as you say, within days, I was having notes through the door from local village groups saying, if you can't get out to buy food, just phone this telephone number and we'll bring food to your door. Don't worry about paying us back. We'll just get you through this. There was, to a degree, the clapping for carers. I mean, that can be critiqued in many regards, but my wife's in the NHS. I know that was a very emotional time for her, actually, to have people, because what you were doing, you weren't just clapping for the NHS, you were clapping for anyone that was helping you through this time. And you were clapping for the people that, probably unlike you and I, who were safely ensconced in our houses, tapping away at our keyboards, earning money that way. You were clapping for people that actually had to go out and face what was perceived to be a killer, non-discriminate virus, and which was terrifying for a period. And there was a lot from that time, but crucially, what you said about the time to think, the time to reflect, the time to create, just for time to switch off. That's what makes me very nervous about where we are now in 2023. That because I will never forget the lessons I learned during that time. I built a business, specifically a purpose-driven business from that time. It's come out of the ashes of COVID. I've realigned my family life. It's transformed my marriage and my relationship with my children because of COVID. I'll never forget it, but I worry that a lot of people in the rush to kind of go back to the office, go back to a 5-day week, kind of lose all the balance and the brilliant things of COVID. I just worry that, again, if we're not careful, we'll buy this kind of government-driven capitalist narrative of you have to be out, you have to be spending money, you have to be keeping up with everyone again, because that's how our society lives on lack.
So, you know, time is the government's worst enemy. They don't want people to have time. And the issue is that everything in this country is done with high levels of urgency, which often is really unnecessary for most things. There is an urgency to support the NHS. There is an urgency to support elderly people. There is an urgency to reform, or there should be an urgency to reform our education system to make it more fit for purpose for those that are minoritized. The things that we should have an urgency for, we generally don't, right? And, you know, so you mentioned earlier about the cost of living crisis and people getting sunk into that. And again, my point here was that I think it was the Runnymede Trust did a report around the cost of living crisis back in, I think, 2016, 2017, based on austerity, what was happening in austerity. And their point was minoritized women are going to be bearing the brunt of austerity measures. They will be entering the worst cost of living crisis imaginable, and they put some statistics in place of what this would look like for particular groups of minoritized women by 2020. Now, for me, I would love that to have been in the national press. I don't know if it was, it might have been, but people to have done something about it at that point, because those groups were the canaries in the mine for what was to happen, even if we didn't have a COVID. Right, we were still running into a cost of living crisis for some groups. So even if we didn't have the Ukraine war, we're still heading into it. So my point here is that actually, if you're not listening to the groups that are most impacted or most affected by government policy or the things that are happening in this country, like a COVID, then actually your ability to create policy that really benefits all is severely limited, because what's happening to those most minoritized groups, as I said, it's going to reach other people, maybe not the elite 5% or whatever, but it's going to reach other people at some point. So if you're not developing policy from that perspective, then your ability to prevent is really severely limited. And I think for me, what happens, and again, this is where the press are really complicit, is the bit where they're part of a news cycle that becomes part of the distraction as opposed to part of the prevention, right? And part of the and part of that for me is probably that most of the people that are in the newspapers are from privileged backgrounds anyway. So I don't know, beyond the work that they're doing, and I'm not broad brushing, because there's some great journalists out there and fantastic journalists out there, but as an institution, who are the people that are in charge of these places? Where are these journalists come from? Who do they spend their time with? Who are their peer groups and stuff, to know that even in a casual conversation, they might be picking up what is happening that might not be on their radar when they're doing their research. And so the news cycle, how policy is made, is created from such a place that is divorced from the lives of ordinary people, that it just tends to be reactive and behind things. It just tends to be very much behind things, and also just not very creative, not very innovative, just you know, it's not, you know, it's like when you watch television and it's like, this doesn't ring true. And it's like, well, it's because it's probably 2 or 3 years late and being done by someone that's got all of the technical expertise, the being in a film school, but actually has no lived expertise of what it's really like to be part of that community. So, it's a massive facade, and it's going to be a massive job to change things. But it's that thing where I guess so many careers now are gentrified. You have to have this qualification to be able to do this. You have to have gone through, not just have a qualification, but have a qualification from a particular institution to be able to get work. You need to be networked up, because that's what's going to help you get into positions. And essentially, you've had this gentrified thing where quite mediocre talent are in significant levels of power, dictating what we see in our newspapers, what we see in our press, in the media, making policy decisions and stuff, because they were lucky to have gone to a particular institution or to have known a right person at the right time.
Interesting, though. Do you think we're potentially moving to a point there? Because obviously, in the last few years, one thing that has fundamentally changed is, for better or worse, the rise of the social influencer. Now, I use that term. I use that term very loosely in terms of what an influencer is and what many of them do. But what we have seen, and again, this is all still within a sphere of whether it's Meta or Musk or whatever platform we're talking about, it's still governed by those same kind of people you're talking about. But it does feel like we have the potential, when you're talking about grassroots movements for change, it feels like there is a bigger opportunity for real, authentic, lived experience voices to get out there and mobilize and have impact away from a traditional kind of media platform. But I'm yet to see that particularly. We saw it a bit with BLM and to a degree, but I'm yet to see that really have a huge impact. I guess kind of Greta Thunberg would be one of the obvious poster children for that, in terms of when you can actually mobilize a community around a core issue. But do you think that it's easy to be critical about social media? But I do think if we could reassess our use of social media and what it's there for, as in not a distraction, but as a movement provider, it could have a lot of power for there.
And people do it really well. Like, there's a social enterprise in America called Color of Change that mobilizes mass campaigns really, really well with social media and online movement building. It is a massive tool. I guess the issue, and again, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in terms of social influencers and where they are, but again, it still comes down to money and access. That if you are a 14-year-old and you've got the money and access to be able to be creating things or creating these platforms and stuff like that, then again, the institution of it might favor those. I think it offers probably a more democratic way of doing things, because it hasn't been regulated in a way that loads the decks in the favor of particular people at this point. But yeah, I think there's still an element of who has the time, networks, access, and money to be able to essentially monetize it and be the influencers of choice going forward. But yeah, if it is probably a more democratic way. Are people listening? I don't know, civil servants and policymakers listening to influencers as much as they still are the national press? We know our national press is dwindling, and it's slowly dying a bit of a death, as people will call it. But at the same time, it still holds a huge level of influence in Whitehall. And I'm not sure that social media has necessarily replaced that on a consistent basis, maybe on a campaign by campaign basis, but not on a consistent basis. But yeah, yet to see whether that can be fully democratized as a route for particular change and influence.
I think we've got the potential to be on the cusp of an exciting time if we can mobilize people. I mean, you say a real kind of, well, there's two things. Firstly, one of the reasons that your book really resonated with me and I wanted to have you on the show was because actually it is a book that's grounded in lived experience. So as you say, it's talking about Black Britishness, it's talking about reggae music, it's talking about your all of your upbringing and your experiences through career alongside a veneer of modern philanthropy and your passions. That's what makes it such a compelling read because it is authentically you. And I think, you know, you talk a lot in the book about the importance of lived experiences of those that are closest to the social issues that need addressing. Why is this so vital to societal transformation? And why does that kind of lived experience piece still remain so much on the periphery?
Because I think we're missing like the biggest thing on the planet is the fact that if you want to solve these issues, and again, you have to qualify this with, do we really want to solve any of these issues in terms of governments and in terms of the energy crisis, in terms of fossil fuel companies and damage to the climate? Do they really want to solve any of these issues, or do they really actually just want to ensure that they've got their money and all of that? So put aside my idealistic framework for the second, right? If you're looking at trying to deal with any major crisis, the lived experience of those that are most harmed by it is your most authentic voice. It's not your only voice, but it's your most authentic voice, because they can probably tell you from their experiences and their expertise that they bring where the problems lie and what needs to be done about it, you know. And that's not, because the way people sometimes look at this, they say, so you're going to put loads of people with lived experience and they're going to become politicians even though they're not qualified and stuff. And I'm not saying that, although having people with lived experience who are our politicians would be your ideal, you know, or who are recreating or reimagining our parliamentary system would be absolutely fantastic. And there are people that are doing that. It's more to say that if you start to value that, then you probably start putting in mechanisms in place about things like the cost of living crisis and other things before they become a crisis, because you're listening to those voices, you're taking heed of their expertise, and also listening to their solutions and innovations about what can be done to alleviate these issues. And that, for me, is really one of the biggest fundamental problems in the UK, is that as a hierarchical country, because we respect these lords and baronesses who have attained whatever qualifications, often through their privileges, not necessarily through their talent, their start line is far ahead of many of us in terms of their ability to access power. But we tend to bow down to their expertise. We tend to think they can't be doing bad, you know, they're for us. You know, as a result, we devalue the voices of what people have to say. And you know, look, of what ordinary people have to say. And people with lived experience might not say it in the ways that we want them to say it, because you will articulate it differently to your lords and baronesses. But either way, that perspective and that expertise, you're talking about moving into a society that will be fundamentally reimagined in a way that will benefit more of us and not just 4 or 5% of us. And so for me, that how you switch the hierarchy and move it is really fundamental to our national identity. It's fundamental to us having services that really benefits all and not just a few. It's fundamental to what citizenship really, really looks like moving forward, and that recognition that we are actually closer as people than governments and people in power want us to ever think we are. And, you know, we talked about Bath and how we met in Bath and everything. And I loved being in Bath. I loved, you know, obviously doing the stuff with John. I just loved the interaction with people, right? I don't know Bath well, but maybe it's just they're a curious bunch. But, you know, it was lots of questions, lots of curiosity, lots of thoughtful interactions that I had while I was at the festival that I really enjoyed. And part of that is sparked by, we've just got a really nice space to have a dialogue, and we don't need to necessarily agree on every single issue. But you know what? A lot of us align on a hell of a lot of different things. If you believed our national press, you probably wouldn't believe that. you
Yeah.
probably believe that
No,
that would be the
the story is in the division, and
yeah,
the news is in the division, and society is grounded in division. It always has been, and the sooner we can shift away from point of actually, hence why COVID for a brief period of time was very special, because there's this brief unifying factor that actually we're all just humans, and we're all
yeah,
terrified, and we've all got families, and we're just trying to get through it, which
yeah.
has never happened in my life and may not happen again. That few months where actually we were all in the same boat.
Mm.
Um,
And saying
I mean,
hello to each other, and
yeah, that was nice while it
where
lasted.
it was that was lovely, like saying hello to people, when we were allowed to go out for the evening walks and stuff like that. And again, it was a lovely moment, to be able to do that. But there was things like that were really, really special. But there was also just other things where there would have been people in sort of high-rise flats and other things that were not able to get out as much. But then you had people with these different initiatives where they were growing plant pots and delivering them to different people in flats and stuff. I'm trying to avoid romanticizing some of this stuff, because it was horrible and it was awful and terrible. But whatever it is that enabled people to put whatever things it was to the side in order to help each other during those moments, that bit is really, really special. That is something that I hugely believe in terms of human spirit, where we can get together and where we can really identify and recognize the things that are dividing us, and really start to focus on the things that are unifying us, the consensus, the things that we need to, in our own ways. Not everyone's going to be a protester. Not everyone is going to be someone that's going to want to make those speeches and stuff, but actually in our actions, be it not particularly supporting a particular company anymore because of their ethics or whatever. There are so many different ways when people can contribute to some of those changes, making people aware of it, as I said, making people aware of what's dividing us, starting to come together in terms of what that consensus building looks like, I think is really important. And as I said, finding those small acts that each and every one of us can do to contribute to something that's a little better, I think is really, really key.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to giving back, I mean, what is it? Do you think that it's the kind of the core driver why so many of us feel compelled to give? Like, whether it's time or resources or money, is it just human nature to want to connect and help others? Do you think we have this? It's very hard to view kind of philanthropy and charity through this, because again, probably the hierarchical structure we live in, it's always viewed through the people that have and people that have a bit less.
Yeah.
As opposed to seeing us all on a level playing field and recognizing that actually I'm in a fortunate position because of actually as a white middle class male in my 30s, I've been in a privileged position in this country. And that's it's an uncomfortable truth to recognize, but it just is that actually my life path, it has been easier for me to access a lot of things. You then can feel a bit overwhelmed with the enormity of other problems affecting other people and be like, well, what do I do to affect change? I mean, you kind of talk a lot in the book about this kind of top-down approach of philanthropy, but it's not really fit for purpose. I mean, what fundamentally needs to change for a real shift to occur in society?
Well, I always come back to it is so you identified this really early when you were talking there, is the fact that people view philanthropy first through a lens of really rich people giving to poor people. That's generally what people will classify as, when the original meaning of philanthropy is love of humankind, and love of humankind is generally what people do, people's interactions with their family, with their loved ones, with their friends, and the way that they act towards them is, love of humankind. So we're talking about activating something that's already in a lot of us and a lot of our souls. We lose it sometimes because life is hard, because we experience, love and loss. because we have financial constraints, we have a lack of time. There is an urgency in this country, which I think is quite deliberate, that takes away a lot of that time. And we sometimes forget about some of the good stuff that we actually do and some of those really wonderful acts. So I think the fundamental thing for me is, one, just really acknowledging that this is about love of humankind and it's not about rich and poor. In fact, I think it's often the case that those with less money are the ones that give in relation to their income more than those that have got, significant amounts of money. And it's also just to move away from the fact that this isn't just about giving money. It's about giving time. It's about resource. It's about letting students stay in your house and, all of these other acts and stuff. So it's really, really broad. So part of this is about activating the power that we have within us. I think, two, there is a piece here around what are the practical things that we can do. And when I say practical things, as I said, not everyone's going to protest, but you might turn around and say, you know what, this is a really unethical company. I'm going to divest. I'm not going to buy from this particular organization anymore. Or you might see a particular charity or social enterprise that's doing something that's really fascinating, that's bringing communities together, and say, you know what, I'm going to volunteer my time. Whatever it is, it doesn't need to be a monumental act, because everything that we see around us seems so huge that you're like, how am I going to attack it? People use their talents and their skills in their own way to be able to provide that contribution. I guess what I was saying in the book was the piece around, if you're going to do that, how do you find and spot something that can contribute to the bigger picture? And I always go back to this conception of moving away from giving, which is very top down, to giving back, and really understanding the reason why we have so many minoritized communities at the bottom of the ladder on a financial level is very deliberate. It's part of our economic systems that keeps lots of people, either from racially minoritized backgrounds, disabled people, etc. It's a very deliberate ploy and a very deliberate thing that's happened through the exploitation and extraction of different communities and countries that keeps this hierarchy in place. When we start to reverse things and start to look at how you value those lived experiences, but those that have been heavily minoritized, one, what often is the case, and I'll say this many times before, it often benefits everyone in society eventually, because they will be the canaries in the mine. But also it's just that conception of giving back and sort of saying, when you are doing, whatever piece of work that you're doing in terms of giving, is this truly reaching those that are the most minoritized with that particular issue? And how can you contribute in that way? And I think part of it for me is around, there is this bigger picture, and we have this power to be able to do it, as I said, through our voting as well, and who we vote for. We spend a lot of time voting tactically because we don't want someone to get into power. So I remember I voted for, in the mayoral elections, I voted for the Women's Equality Party. And I voted for the Women's Equality Party, which is led by Mandu Reid, because I read them, even though they're not a big party and people won't know about them as much as they will the other candidates, I actually read their manifesto and their stuff, and I was like, actually, I believe in this. I'm not doing the tactical voting thing. This is actually what I want to vote for, as opposed to I've been voting in a particular way for 50 years, or I've been, actually, no, not 50 years, because I'm not that old, but but for 30 years, it was, for me personally, I'm not saying for other people, I'm just saying for me personally, it was like, when I'm reading everything side by side, this is what I believe in more than anything else. That's why I'm going to vote. So that's my little,
and that's where you have to have hope, right? We do ultimately live in a democracy. The information is out there if you dig deep enough to find it. So if enough people had voted as well, they would have got in. We do have the power to make change, but we have to remember we're not encouraged to.
So that is the key. That is the absolute key. We don't know as much about the Women's Equality Party because they don't have as much money to get their campaigns out there as everyone else, and they're not as long established party. But you're right. The bit around hope is, and it's a contentious word because the hope can be like, oh my God, hope without, a kind of plan of action is kind of just ends up making you feel disappointed. I guess my point here is that, and I've loaded the books with loads of different examples of people that are doing great things, is yes, you need hope, but you need like a roadmap to get there. And there are so many good organizations and people. Some are in my book, some are in John Alexander's book, that are like, actually, there are communities, and actually it's not people, because again, we have this conception it's always got to be this individual, and most of the people in the book, I might mention them as an individual, but they're actually communities that are doing fantastic work. Healing Justice London are doing fantastic work, Civic Square, Yard, Art House, and others, Systemic Justice, are fabulous communities that are developing practices that gives legitimate hope, but with clear roadmaps of what change looks like. And I think, to your point, Women's Equality Party, if more people knew more about their work and were voting through what they believe in and hope and stuff like that, then you have a slightly different conception of some of the decisions that you make, just in the same way that if someone might make you aware of a particular organization that is damaging our environment, then your act might be, you know what, I'm not going to, purchase anything from this particular organization. When that starts to cascade, that is hugely powerful. And
sometimes just doing nothing, isn't it? Like, I'm not going to buy that item. I'm not going, sometimes inaction is as powerful as action.
And look, these are big things that accumulate, right? These are huge things that accumulate. And so I'm not saying you decide not to buy from a particular shop and you're like, job done, and you pat yourself on the back and all of that. But, sometimes it's around, what do you do on a daily basis that starts to break the cycle of kind of negativity? So I was like urging people in the book, partially like, here's all of these great organizations doing fabulous things. Go onto their website, listen to podcasts and hear what they have to say. Do that for 5 or 10 minutes a day, just about people that are doing good, and doing good in a way that's going to benefit everyone, but done through the lens of the most marginalized. Just check out what they're doing and see what you can activate with yourself. It's that thing about, how do you gain the muscle power? It's like working out, right? Or jogging or whatever. You kind of have to do things on a regular basis and in a routine to enable you to build that muscle power, or whatever it's called, to be able to think about what it is that you do. So I think in the book, I put loads of websites, and there's loads of podcasts and other things of, just listen to this for 10 minutes a day. Just go onto the website, see what people are doing, see where you can really contribute to some of those changes. And it just enables you that when you do an act, you kind of know what the bigger purpose is. And I think that kind of is really strong in terms of enabling people to just continue to do good in a very different way, knowing that there's a bigger picture.
I do genuinely think there's an innate human desire to do good and to leave the world in a slightly better place than you found it. And I'm grateful to you for your time today, Derek. I'm grateful for the book you've written, for the voice you're putting out there, for the work you and John are both doing. I'm sure this will be the first of many conversations you and I have down the road, because we're very, very aligned. Just to leave our listeners with a kind of final piece, can you just tell us a little bit about 10 years time and where to also find your website and all that kind of stuff?
10 years time, our website is 10yearstime.com. And as I said, we're philanthropy advisors. So we work with donors and foundations to support them in their giving. So a number of the organizations and people that I've mentioned before, you'll see them on our website. We run education programs, but we really just help people to do good better.
There you go. Well, look, thank you so much, Derek, for joining me today. I'll put all of the details of how to connect with Derek in the show notes so you can find all of those. But that wraps us up for today. Thank you to everyone for being part of the Good Journeys for Second Mountain podcast today. All of our past inspiring episodes can be found over on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music and YouTube. Please do consider leaving a review and subscribing, because that all helps us to keep doing what we're doing and having these conversations. That's it for today. Thank you to my guest, Derek. Thank you, as always, to my excellent producer, Laurette's Visuals. And most importantly, thank you to you for joining us for this inspiring conversation. So this has been the Good Journeys pod. Until next time, let's keep climbing together, look after yourselves, and I'll see you all again soon.